Good morning. Welcome to Authors at Google in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Today it's my great pleasure to introduce one of the most interesting and successful people I know, Hank Phillipi Ryan. Hank is the Anthony, Agatha, and McCavity award-winning author of 5 mystery novels, Prime Time, FaceTime, Airtime, Drive Time, and now The Other Woman, which is in front of you. Her first release in hardcover, which went back for a second printing, I think, the first week, so it's been highly successful. More than an author, which would be enough, Hank has also been an award-winning investigative reporter at Boston's Channel 7 for 27 years, no, 30 years.
Yesterday was my 30-year anniversary, in Boston only.
And
you started at age 5?
Ah, thank you. Son, give this guy another book.
and she has almost as many Emmys as she has years at Channel 7, 28 Emmys, and these are real Emmys, not daytime Emmys, so, or Golden Globes, so they mean something. But before Channel 7, she was a reporter. I know she'll talk about that this day. She toured the country with the photographer Richard Avedon and Hunter S. Thompson. I told her just now, you haven't written a book about touring with Thompson, and she said nobody would believe it, but I think we should demand it here today. America wants to read this book. But without further ado, Hank Phillipi Ryan.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me here today. The Hunter Thompson story that I cannot tell is we went to Florida. We were doing a series of stories on the '76 presidential election, and we were interviewing all the possible candidates for the Democratic nomination. And we went to Florida to interview, I can't even remember who it was. You know, I was a kid, you know, I was 21 or something like that, so this was pretty interesting. So it was Hunter Thompson and Pat Caddell. Do you remember Pat Caddell from the political campaign, and Bob Shrum? And we all went to a hotel room in Florida, and Hunter taught me how to inhale lighter fluid and then light it on fire so you could breathe fire. Do not try this at home. And I couldn't do it now if you asked me to, but here we are in like the Hilton or something like that, playing with lighter fluid and lighting it on fire. We all thought we were hilarious. I would not do that now, but that's just part of the story. Hunter and I went out to dinner once in Washington, D.C., and you know, I mean, you're set with who Hunter Thompson is, right? You're okay. Went out to dinner in Washington, D.C., and it was so long ago that the metro system in Washington hadn't been built yet. So the streets were all torn up, and the streets were wooden in Washington, D.C. It was like 1971 or so. The streets were wooden and slick, and it was pouring down rain. And Hunter has this rental car that's fishtailing through the streets of Washington on this wet wood. And he says, wow, I hope the police don't stop us. I hope we don't get into an accident, because the police will go crazy when they find out what's in the trunk. I'm like, really? You know, I'm a reporter for Rolling Stone magazine. I don't want to be with Hunter Thompson when the police come and we all get arrested and I have to call my mom, you know, in Indianapolis and say, guess what? And I'm sure he was kidding. I'm sure he was kidding. I never looked in the trunk to make sure. So we go out to dinner to like Don Juan's or something like that, Mexican restaurant, and Hunter orders 5 margaritas. And I'm like, you're not even going to drink 5 margaritas. You know, why would you do that? And he says, I just want to see if the waitress will bring them. I just want to see if she will. You know, so that's kind of what he was like. He was also so generous. I mean, he came across as this gonzo journalist who was tough and wacky and crazy and nuts. I mean, nuts. But he was really the kindest, most gentle person you could possibly imagine. And here's how long ago it was. He asked me if I had ever heard of Jimmy Buffett. And I said no. So that's how long ago it was. And he said, well, come with me. And he took me to a record store. Are you okay on record store? He took me to a record store and bought me all the Jimmy Buffett albums, which I still had. So that's a generous heart. You know, that is a wonderful guy. So when I look back in those years, working in Washington, D.C. during Watergate, during the Nixon presidency, when Woodward and Bernstein's articles were coming out every day, that I transitioned to covering the Ford White House for Rolling Stone for a while. I did a column called Capital Chatter, which was sort of Washington gossip. Now, we had a 3-week lead time. So if you can imagine doing a gossip column, when it has to hold and be new for 3 weeks, that's just like gossip is gone in a moment. So nothing's going to hold for 3 weeks. So I did stuff like I covered Susan Ford's prom at the White House. You know, that was pretty surreal and kind of great. So it was a fun time. But you know, I'm here for the other woman. Although when I'm finished yapping, I'll be delighted to answer any questions about any realm of my career that you like: writing or thinking or imagination or reporting or investigative reporting or mysteries or television or anything like that. But here's, you know, when I see the other woman, this is my first hardcover. I love it. It is in a second printing already. It's been on the Boston Globe bestseller list twice, went to #2. That pesky Gone Girl is #1. Can't imagine. But what I also didn't imagine when I wrote this book is that the cover would look like this. It says, Hank Phillipi Ryan, the other woman. Like, no. I should have thought that through a little bit more. And the second book in the series, which comes out next year, is called The Wrong Girl. Hank Phillipi Ryan, The Wrong Girl. So I need to think, and maybe you can help me at some point, think of a better title for the third book. You know, Hank Phillipi Ryan, Really Good, or, you know, something, Hank Phillipi Ryan, Buy This Book, or something like that. That is a little more encouraging. You know, it reminds me of this juxtaposition of title reminds me of a story that we did a couple of years ago. As you know, I'm the investigative reporter at Channel 7. I've just worked there now for 30 years. Yesterday is my anniversary. Crazy. But since 1988, I've been the investigative reporter at Channel 7. And we did a story a couple of years ago on headlights on cars, not headlights, but headlights on cars, and how they diminish, their power diminishes over time. And people think that they can't see as well, but really it's that their headlights aren't working as well as they did before. So I promise you this has a point. We got 20 cars from a car dealer and lined them up, everything from like a 1999 Ford Gizmo or whatever they had, to like the big flashy Jaguar something or other with xenon headlights or Xeon or whatever it is. And we lined them all up and we turned on the headlights at night, and we had a guy who was expert in lighting calibrate the light that came, the foot candles that came from each headlight. And sure enough, it turned out that the headlights got worse as time went by. The bulbs themselves would get dim, and the plastic in the headlight cover would get thick and opaque and make it more difficult to see. So here's a good story. You know, we found, good, this is a good story. People need to know this. So we reported the story. I wrote the story. I went into the edit booth and I edited the story and made a little movie out of it. And you know, the last thing that you do before a story goes on TV, an investigative story, is you do the stand-up in the newsroom when the stand-up close to the story. Come on in. The stand-up close to the story, which is when the reporter stands in front of the graphic that describes the story and says, you know, for more on this, go to our website, yap, yap, yap. So I put on my spiffy little reporter suit and a whole bunch of makeup and comb my hair, and I'm going down to the newsroom to stand in front of the graphic. And I turn around, and the graphic, like this, the graphic says, dangerously dim. And I said to the news, so I go to the news director and I say, I cannot stand in front of a graphic that says dangerously dim. You know, and he laughed just like you did. And then he goes, yeah, we don't really have time to fix that. So I had to stand in front of this stupid graphic that says dangerously dim. The only thing that I've ever seen that's sort of worse than that is we had an anchor woman, this gorgeous anchor woman, who had to stand in front of a graphic that said botched plastic surgery. Oh. So you know, you have to. These are things that you just don't think about, you know, as viewers. Things that the art department ought to think about, but they rarely do. But as I said, I've been a reporter for 30 years. I've wired myself with hidden cameras. I've confronted corrupt politicians. I've chased down criminals. I've gone in disguise and undercover and been tear gassed and gotten too close to fires and been to murder scenes and gosh, interviewed everybody from Jimmy Carter to Muhammad Ali to Prince Charles. And it's been fabulous. You know, I love my job as a reporter. It's one of those professions where every day you go to work and you have no idea what's going to happen. And that's good. You know, that's good. I have a cartoon, I think it's a Zippy. No, it isn't. I have a cartoon on my refrigerator that has two guys on a desert island, clearly by themselves. And one of them says to the other, "You mean we're out here on our own in the middle of nowhere? We have no idea what's going to happen and no control over our future?" And the second guy says, "Yeah." And the first guy says, "Cool." You know, and that's sort of how I look at the world, that there's so many open doors and so many possibilities and so many things that could happen, and everything could turn into a story. Now, when I started in my real grown-up, and my first job was at the Dairy Queen, and I can still make a dip cone with the curly Q on top, which I may need someday. But my first real job in grown-up world was as a campaign worker, a political staffer in a political campaign in my home in Indiana. You know, and I took constituent calls and organized advance teams and went to county fairs and flew in the helicopter with the candidate and ate corn dogs and wrote press releases and stuff like that. And I really got an inside view of what it's like to work in politics, what politicians want, what candidates want, how they think, what they need, the desire for power, how they manipulate, how they try to manipulate how we think, no matter what's really true, that they want you to think what they want you to think. And at that time, I thought I wanted to be in politics. But what happened was, sadly, none of the candidates I ever worked for actually won. And I began to think that perhaps I had chosen the wrong field. Not that I was in charge, no, I was 20, but nevertheless, this was not going my way. Now, I have a pretty abiding philosophy that when something bad happens in your life, it only means that something fabulous is going to happen soon after. I mean, you've had this happen, that you think, oh my goodness, I'm so disappointed, I'm doomed, my life is over, I will never be okay. And then soon after, some fabulous thing occurs that makes you realize that if the bad thing hadn't happened, the good thing wouldn't have happened next. You know what I mean? You've had that. And so that is exactly why I am where I am today, is because no politician who I ever worked for actually won. And here's why. When a guy who was running for governor of Indiana lost the election, I was out of a job. And instead of being a hotshot campaign aide to the governor of Indiana, I was unemployed. I was unemployed. And an English major, so skillless and unemployed, you know, completely unemployable. So I went to the biggest radio station in Indianapolis, my hometown, and applied for the job as a reporter. They had a job opening for a reporter. This was 1971. I applied for the job as a reporter. And the news director, you know, this guy who was kind of like Lou Grant, remember Lou Grant, sort of crusty but benign, says, well, do you have any experience? Do you have any experience as a reporter? Have you ever written a news story? Have you ever interviewed anyone? Have you ever written a news release? Have you ever covered any kind of a story? Have you done, did you go to journalism school? You know, work on the school paper? Anything? I'm like, oh, drat, you know, no. I have no experience. The dreaded experience question, you know, nothing. So, but you know, I was young and I thought, I can do this. He should just hire me. So I said, no, you know, I don't really have any experience, but I grew up here in Indianapolis and I know where all the streets are. And you kind of got to go with what you have. And I said, and your license is up for renewal at the FCC and you don't have any women working here. And then I just smiled. And the next day, I had my first job in broadcasting. So, you know, and here's why I tell you this. Here's why I tell you this. One, because it won't work anymore. When I talk to journalism classes, I say, don't go in and say you should hire me because I'm a woman. They're going to be like, yeah, you and everybody else in the office. That's my boss is a woman, her boss is a woman, and her boss is a woman. So that's very different from how it was back then. In the days when I started, when Andrea Mitchell started, when Leslie Stahl started, when Nancy Dickerson started, and Barbara Walters and Jane Pauley, you know, all of us were breaking the glass ceiling for women in broadcasting at the time. You know, when you walked into a newsroom, when I started back in the 70s, everybody was smoking. Everybody was yelling. there was smoke and cigarettes and typewriters and people yelling, and now they're quiet and full of women and no smoking. I mean, it's completely, the world has changed so incredibly much. You know, so who would have thought back in the day when you had to get up to change the channel, do you remember that? You had to get up to change the channel, that now there would be 900 channels and Diane Sawyer would be anchoring the evening news. I mean, 35 years ago, that was unthinkable. So the world has definitely changed since then. But I think I knew from the moment I read my first Sherlock Holmes story and my first Nancy Drew book that I wanted to be a mystery author. You read Nancy Drew. Did you read Nancy Drew, the real ones? There was the clue in the old clock and the clue in the diary, which I thought was clue in the dairy for like most of the book. So I'm going, shouldn't there be some cows in this? There weren't. I figured that out. And then I went on to the wonderful British women mystery authors, Marjorie Allingham, Josephine Tay, Ngaio Marsh, and of course Agatha Christie, who my idol when I was 13 years old. And in the interesting sort of synchronistic world, the way it is, to my first novel won the Agatha for Best First Mystery. So who'd have thought, you know, this 13-year-old loving Agatha Christie would 50 years later win an award for Best Traditional Mystery named after her. So that's how the world is so wonderful and the world is so mysterious. But then, one day, I sneaked from my parents' bookshelves the book Failsafe. Do you remember Failsafe at all? Really, really scary book about the Cold War. And I terrified myself. And then I read On the Beach and 7 Days in May and Advise and Consent and all these wonderful political, dark political thrillers. And I realized that there was another kind of literature out there. It was suspense. And that's what all of that goes into The Other Woman. But my life turned out a different way, as you know. I wasn't a mystery author back then. I turned out to be a television reporter because that day in Indianapolis, when I talked to the guy about the FCC, I took a chance, I had some confidence, and I found my calling, just by chance. I became a TV reporter, and you might think that being a reporter for television, an investigative reporter, and writing fiction are very different. And of course they are, because in television, you can't make stuff up. This is the key difference. But basically, in television and in mystery writing, they're very similar, because the key of both of them is to tell a good story. It's only and all about telling a good story with a wonderful plot and with compelling characters where the good guys win and the bad guys get what's coming to them. When at the end there's a satisfying ending with some justice and you get to change the world a little bit. And whether it's in television or in fiction, that's my goal, to change the world a little bit. You know, every one of those 28 Emmys that I have represents a secret that we discovered that someone didn't want you to know. You know what I mean? It's not just like a good story, but it's a thing that someone was trying to keep you from knowing that we revealed. You know, quickly in our stories, we did stories about the mortgage industry and home improvement contractors in Massachusetts that resulted in 3 new laws being passed. We got people's homes out of foreclosure. People's homes out of foreclosure, and millions of dollars in refunds and restitution. We discovered why there was no diversity at all in federal jury pools in Massachusetts. No people of color at all for years in federal jury pools in Massachusetts. No diversity, and we found out why that was, and now that's getting changed. We discovered that it's possible that when you call 911 for emergency help, that the police and firefighters, the emergency responders, were being sent to the wrong address. Over and over and over and over, people were being sent to the wrong address. The state had no idea. And we, as a result of our story, that system is being changed. We had to battle up to the Secretary of State's office to get them to give us the information about why you weren't receiving your emergency response in the proper way. So that's, you know, it's been very exciting. Fiction and investigative reporting are all about secrets. Who knows a secret? Who has a secret? Who's telling the secret? Who's going to find out the secret? And what's going to happen as a result of that? So every day, what I do every day is look for secrets. Also every day, I look for a good idea. And it's really fascinating to me to think about, every story I write and every book that I write starts with the nugget of a wonderful idea. Harlan Coben, do you know the author Harlan Coben, talks about how he writhes on the couch for a month to think of his good story. All authors worry about where their next idea will come from. And it's fascinating to me to think about how our minds work. A couple of years ago, 5 years ago, I was still looking for a plot for my first book. I got an email, a spam email, and I was deleting all the spam from my computer. You know how you do that, just blink, 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 because you recognize it instantly. And I opened one by mistake. And in it, the subject line said, "A new refinancing deal for you." But in the body of the email was what looked like lines from a play by Shakespeare. And I thought, why would somebody put that there? Why would someone put a Shakespeare play in the body of an email about mortgage refinancing? And it crossed my mind that it might be a secret message. And then I thought, oh my gosh, ding, 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 secret messages in computer spam. And I thought, that is an idea for a mystery. And that turned out to be Prime Time, my first book. And I'll tell you that I went to the FBI Citizens Academy, which is this 8-week course that the FBI gives to the public to come in and learn how they work. So on the cyber crimes day, I took aside the agent who was in charge of federal cyber crimes, and I said, can I tell you my idea for a mystery? And can you imagine this guy's like, oh my gosh, here's some woman who wants to tell me her idea for a mystery. Sure, lady, tell me the idea. So I told him about the secret messages in computer spam, and his eyes got bigger and bigger and bigger. And he said, that would work. And I said, I know. And he said, have you ever had any cases like that? And he said, no. And I said, well, maybe I should have chosen a life of crime rather than a life as a mystery author. And he says, no, watch it, we got you, we're on to you now. So don't try it. You know why it would work. I mean, you all know why it would work, because it was plain text. I was seeing the plain text instead of the HTML, and somebody had just put that in, but I didn't know that. So it was just this incredible, mysterious thing that happened. But like every other author, after I had a good idea, I wondered if I would ever have another good idea. I say to my husband, I'm never going to write another book because I'll never have another good idea. I'm never going to do another investigative story because I'll never have another good idea. And he says, you always say that. And I say, I know, but this is the time I'm never going to have another good idea. And he says, you always say that too. And I say, I know, but this could be the time that I really never have another good idea. And somehow the universe, it seems to me, and I don't know if you've had this happen to you, but when you need the idea, when it's really time for the idea, the universe provides the idea for you. Have you had this? It's unbelievable. And if you just sort of let go and be open to the thought, sometimes it just shows up. And I don't mean to sound woo-woo, or it's not magic, it's just the flow. Forgive me for that. But sometimes that happens, and it happened to me in writing this book. Now, I'll tell you that my husband and I don't celebrate the anniversary of the day we met. We do not. We celebrate the anniversary of the day before we met. And we call that You Never Know Day. Because you never know what wonderful thing is around the next corner. And one day we didn't know the other person existed. The next day we met, and we haven't been apart since then, 17 years ago. So you never know day. You never know what's around the corner. And that's where this book came from. Remember I said my philosophy about good stuff coming out of bad. I needed a root canal. I needed a root canal. And you wonder what good could come out of getting a root canal. So I'm in the dentist's office, my face is puffy, I'm cranky, I'm missing work. I'm going like, oh my gosh, I can't be here, I can't be here, I have to go. And I was reading an old people magazine, not an old people magazine, an old people magazine. And I was reading an article about Mark Sanford, the ex-governor of South Carolina. You know who that is, of course, and the one who told his wife and his family that he was out hiking the Appalachian Trail when really he was off with his Argentinian mistress. And in the dentist's office, in pain, puffy face, I'm thinking, who would be the other woman? Who would be this Argentinian mistress? Who would do that? Who would actively decide to ruin her life? Who would actively decide to ruin the life of this man she ostensibly loves? You know, you think about these people that we've known. I mean, first of all, you're going to get caught. You're going to get caught. From Kay Summersby to Elizabeth Ray to Riel Hunter. I mean, Monica Lewinsky could win the Nobel Prize, right? And what would the headline say? Monica Lewinsky, paramour of President Clinton, wins Nobel Prize, right? It's never going to go away. So I was just obsessed with who would be the other woman. You're going to ruin your life. You're going to ruin the guy you ostensibly love. His life is ruined. His wife's life, his family's life, his children's life, his employees' life, his staff's life. And here's a guy who is the elected governor of a state. And, you know, all of us are jaded and cynical and suspicious enough of people in politics and public service, when really being a public servant and giving your life to politics and lawmaking is the highest calling you can have. It's one of the most honorable things you can do. So I started getting cranky and angry about why someone would take that and why would someone be such a bad guy and make everybody else look bad too. So I began to wonder whether there was a big, juicy story that I could write about motivation. I began to wonder whether there was a thriller about why someone would be the other woman. Was it lust? Was it power? Was it corruption? Was it need? Was it desire? Was it selfishness? Or maybe there was a motivation that I hadn't thought of yet that would really talk about why someone would do that. And in the end of this article, in People magazine, I mean, through my pain, I'm thinking about this. In the end of this article, someone says, you can choose your sin, but you cannot choose your consequences. And I just thought, my book, my book, my book. Because we all have, everything we do has a consequence. But even when we think we're making the right decision, it has a consequence. And that's what I wanted my book to be about. It takes place in Boston. It's very local. You'll recognize the Esplanade and Mass Pike. I mean, my husband and I will be driving on the Mass Pike and I'll say, oh, exit 17. This is where Jane gets chased by the truck. And then I think, no, I made that up. You know, so it's so realistic and so Bostonian that sometimes I forget what's real and what's not real. But inside, it takes place right now, actually, in the pivotal weeks before a Senate election. A Boston television reporter on the trail of an ex-governor's secret mistress, a Boston police detective on the trail of a possible serial killer. 2 women's bodies have been found under bridges, the Zakim Bridge and the BU Bridge specifically. Both killed the same way, both with no identification and no shoes. When the next victim is a key player in the political campaign the reporter is covering, Jane the reporter is covering, when the next victim is the key player in the political campaign, Jane the reporter and Jake the cop believe that they might be on the trail of the same person. And this is someone who will stop at nothing to prevent a scandal. So in the book it says, seduction, betrayal, and murder. It's going to take a lot more than votes to win this election. So Booklist Starred Review called it a perfect thriller for the election season. And you can't really do better than perfect. Let me just wrap up by saying that a couple of months ago, my husband and I went to hear Judy Collins at Sanford Theater at Harvard. Did you go? She was so amazing. And Judy Collins, this brilliant icon, gorgeous singer, told the story of how she had been brought up as a kid to be a concert pianist. Her parents wanted her to be a concert pianist, and she was trained for that. But she said she always knew that she wanted to be a folk singer. And at age 16, she left home, she left Denver, and ran off to New York to become a folk singer, to make her mark. And she said, I went to New York and I took all my songs with me. And then she said, of course, I hadn't written any of them yet. And that touched me so much because it made me realize that we all have songs And some of them we haven't quite written yet because we haven't quite decided that it's the time to do so. She decided it was the time to do so. I'm the poster child for having a time to do so. I didn't start writing my mysteries until I was 55 years old. You know, I was 62 yesterday. No, I was 63 yesterday. And, you know, who'd have thought that all that work in politics and all those years as a reporter, and I'm still a reporter, weren't the end in themselves. It wasn't about being a reporter. It wasn't about being a political campaign staffer. It was 40 years of research. You know, it was 40 years of research for this part of my life, which is so exciting. And I tell people, you know, if there's something you want to do, like make a lot of noise, if there's something you want to do, like, you know, write that book of poetry, or take that trip, or learn Italian, or start a business, or try something new, please do that. You know, you don't want to wake up one morning and think, I regret that I didn't try that. I regret that I didn't do that. There's, you know, I have a motto on my bulletin board, and it says, leap and the net will appear. Leap and the net will appear. And that's how I feel about the world. You know, if not now, when are we going to do this? When I finished my first book, Primetime, I called my husband into the room and I said, sweetheart, watch this. And I typed the end. And then I burst into tears. I burst into tears because I knew no matter what happened with that book, I had done something that I always wanted to do. I had followed my dreams. And of course, I shouldn't have cried when I typed the end, because it wasn't the end. It wasn't the end at all. It was the beginning of this wonderful new second half of my life. And I'm so happy to be here today to share it with you. Thank you very much for inviting me. I would be delighted to answer any questions about reporting or writing or mysteries or the mysteries of television or juggling two different careers, anything like that. Anybody have a question? Yes.
So apparently you don't write your own graphics, but do you write your own material as an investigative reporter?
Do I write my own material as investigative reporter? Yes, I do, every word. It's one of the joys of being able to tell a story is that I have a tremendous amount of material. Well, I start out with nothing. I start out with an idea. And then we research and do interviews and look up documents and track down clues and follow leads and come up with like volumes and volumes and volumes of stuff. And then we shoot our interviews and shoot our video. We usually shoot about 18 times more video than ever goes on the air. So you can imagine what it's like to take all this voluminous information that's complicated and mysterious and make it into a compelling little movie. To take, you know, to narrow it to the essence. And
You're
yes,
a documentary filmmaker in addition to all these other things.
Well, yes, kind of a documentary filmmaker, because every news story is a little movie. Every news story that we write is a little movie. So we get told we have 3 minutes for a story, let's say. So you have to figure out how to tell the story in 3 minutes. And then sometimes if some big breaking news thing happens, you know, the boss will come in and say, you can only have a minute and a half. And so then we have to fix the little movie to make it be the same good story in a minute and a half. So your mind is always working about how to take the very best things that you have and put them together so that no one will turn the channel. And writing those stories, taking all the puzzle pieces and seeing what picture it makes. You know what I mean? Because at the beginning you don't know. Taking those puzzle pieces and seeing what picture it makes in the most compelling ways is really one of the most fun parts of my job. Who else has a question? Yes, Kathleen.
I have to assume that a certain amount of your experience is going in there, being Jane. And I'm wondering how you can take someone who is supposed to have the naivete of maybe being willing to sniff a little lighter fluid, or, but also has the good sense to know when the license is being renewed for the local radio station. With all of your experience, how do you keep her from being too smart to be believable?
Oh, that's so interesting. How do I keep my main character from being too smart to be believable? That's funny. I've never been asked that, and that's a terrific question. What I try to do with my characters is make them be real. Someone who you might really know. And one of the magical, it's not magic, but one of the amazing things about writing is how you're you're making a real character out of something that didn't exist before. You know the Stephen Sondheim musical, Sunday in the Park with George? Have you seen that at all? It's about creativity, and it's about, he's painting, he has a blank canvas, and he sings this song called Finishing the Hat. And he's painting this hat. And he says, look, I made a hat where there never was a hat. And that's how I feel about creating my characters. I'm creating something out of nothing. I'm making a person who never was there before. I'm making hats, new hats, every day as a reporter, as a writer. So Jane, or all of my characters, I don't have an outline. I don't know where the books are going. Everything that happens is a surprise. So I see how she would really behave. You know, sometimes my characters say things that I hadn't planned for them to say. Sometimes they won't say the things that I have planned for them to say. What I worry more about not making a character do something that's silly. I don't want people to say, you would never do that. You know, you see the movies or read the books where you think, don't go in the basement. You know, the bad guy is in the basement. At least in the movies, they have the music. You know, when that music starts, you know, you don't go in there. What I worry more about than making her too smart, because she's vulnerable and she's 33 and Jane is learning her way in the news business. She's been unfairly fired. She's been humiliated. She's trying to get her reputation back in this book. So I dig from my own personal experiences in those emotions of being 33, which now at 63, I can look back on that in a certain way and take the things that work and not take the things that don't work. So I've never thought about not making her too smart. I have thought about making her too dumb. Isn't that so interesting? Yes?
You said this is your first hardcover, which I always assumed books started as hardcover and then paperback. So the earlier books started as paperback?
Yes. You're asking about my first hardcover and that you thought that all books started as hardcover. No. Some books start as what they call paperback originals. And they can be the mass market size, which is the pocketbook size, and then there's the trade paperbacks, which are bigger and more sort of elegant looking and more expensive, and then the hardcover books. And the publisher decides how they're going to use your manuscript and how they're going to make that look, whether it's going to be a hardcover like this or a paperback. Paperback originals are fabulous. You can tuck them in your pocket, you can tuck them in your briefcase. You know, you read them fast, and they're not a treasure. But they are convenient. Some, you know, I mean, look at this, it's beautiful. It's embossed, it's metallic. You know, when my agent got the book, she called me and she said, wait till you see your book, it's so delicious, I could eat it, you know, but she's enthusiastic. So the publisher decides what's going to be a hardcover, what's going to be a paperback. They decide the print run, they decide with the distribution, they decide what the cover is going to look like. They decide everything. The author is just happy that their book is going to be published. So, yes.
I'm interested in the editing process because I know you said like you got to the end of your first book and wrote the end, but I would guess that's the beginning of like going through the whole editing process. And I'm just wondering what that was like, maybe your first time around, and then what was different this time around because you had done it before.
The editing process is really one of my favorite parts. It is so interesting to see the book that you meant to write emerge from all the junk that you take out. You asked me about my first book. When I wrote Primetime, do we have time? What's our timing? Okay. When I wrote my first book, I took the disc that the book was on to the Kinko's. This is how long ago it was. And I went to the Kinko's and I said, could you print this for me? It's my novel. And the guy says, yeah, okay. And so just like did you see the movie Sideways? Okay, so just like in Sideways, I come back to get my book later, and I say, I'm here to pick up my printing, and the guy says, oh, you're the one with the novel. And I thought, oh, he read it. You know, he read it and he loves it. So I said, yes. So he says, okay, here, and he bends down and he picks up a ream box and puts it on the counter. I said, okay, thank you, and he goes, no, wait. And he bends down and picks up another ream box. It was 723 pages long. You know, a book can be like 323 pages long. I just was such a newbie that I hadn't numbered the pages, first of all. So I had to, so in answer to your question, you know, finally, I had to cut 400 pages from my book. I had to cut 400 pages. And that was the most educational, fabulous, wonderful experience that I've ever had in writing, because it made me question every single word, every single scene, every single idea that I had in the book. So I went through and I asked myself, why is this here? Why do they say this? What is this scene for? What is this paragraph for? Why did I choose this particular word? Can I take, there are 10 words here, can I make it into one word? What's the concept of this entire page? Can I take this one page and make it into one word? Do I really need it? Do I need it at all? And that editing process, I mean, I just got goosebumps thinking about it. How, you know, when you're writing and your brain just sort of flows sometimes, you're just going to put stuff down that's vamping and transition. When you go back and look at it, when you go back and look at the editing, you see what's derivative, you see what's stupid, you see the parts where you thought, oh, I'm such a good writer, and that's the part that's got to go, because, you know, that's just showing off. You see what's repetitive, you see what's unintentional, you see what's tangential, you see what... I cut everything that wasn't the story, is what happened. I cut everything that wasn't the story. And when I saw what was left, you know, that was fabulous. So the difficult part for me is writing that first draft, and I just power through and write the story. And then I go back and look at it using the skills that I learned in my first book. I try not to write that stuff now anyway, so so my stories don't turn out to be 700 pages long. But they're always, you know, 10,000 words too long. And I generally have to cut 10,000 words. And it's wonderful. It's like making a statue, and you cut away the parts you don't need, and then that's what's left. I have a wonderful editor now who, as I'm writing for myself, and then I'm writing as her. You know, I think, what would Kristen say about this? So I use what she's taught me too to make a difference in the book. But I know that shorter is always better, cute never works, and just tell the story. Is that what you mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I also wonder sometimes if there's things like you find the deleted scenes at the end of movies sometimes, like the scenes they pulled out because they just didn't work. But sometimes those are the director's favorite.
Yes.
And so I wonder if that, like, did you go through that process where, like, some of your favorite parts of the book you had to cut?
I love deleted scenes. I love deleted scenes. I watch them all the time because I do think, just as you say, that they give a fresh look at what the director was trying to convey. But, you know, when you're in a movie and you're kind of going like this and trying to see what time it is, that's what I do in my books too. If I think, you know, I love this, but people are going to be thinking, you know, maybe I should make dinner. You know, I don't want your attention to stray. Mm-hmm. So, but I'll tell you, unlike fabulous directors whose deleted scenes are so fabulous that they leave them on the DVDs, when I cut a scene, part of the power of cutting is I think I have this, I've written this, I can keep this, and I can use this another time. So it's not, I'm not making it disappear, I'm just moving it to another place. And when I go back and look at them later, they're just awful. It's awful. They're terrible. It's nothing you would ever use. I think, how could I ever have written this? How could I ever have thought this was good? So my deleted scenes are better deleted. But I love to find them. There's the power in finding what's wrong. You know what I mean? There's the power of finding your mistake and recognizing that, and having the nerve to take it out. And then at the end, you think, yay, it's better now, and I did that. That's education, that's learning. Yes?
You seem very positive about your entire career, and I always thought that an important part of being an investigative reporter would involve making a lot of people very angry at you.
Yes.
Wanting to sue you or even just throw you off a bridge somewhere.
Yes, indeed. People have throw me off a bridge. That's a good idea for a book. Yes, I've had a lot of people be very upset with me and very angry with me. I've gotten a lot of threats of violence, threats of lawsuits. I've never been held at gunpoint like Jane is. But I have had people come to my house. I have had people send me nasty letters. I've had many threats of violence, many threats of lawsuits. People say to me, people who are in my story say, how could you do that to me? How could you do that? How could you wrecked my life? How could you do that? And I say, I didn't do anything. You did. I just told. And that's a different deal. And I am so careful, knock on wood, for my God. I'm so careful to be right, if you know what I mean. The the stress of being an investigative reporter not only has to do with coming up with a good story, but in my job, I can never be wrong. I can never be wrong. I can never make a mistake. I can never be a minute late. I can never choose the wrong word. You know what I mean? So that's a lot of pressure. And so when my stories are on the air, they're right. I feel like I need to touch Formica again. They're right. And so I don't feel bad about making someone's life miserable. When was the last time you heard a quote like that? Because I didn't do it. They did it. And also the thing about being an investigative reporter for television is that when you're out on a story, I have a photographer with me, right? So I say to him, if it looks like somebody's going to haul off and hit me, make sure you're rolling. You know, because who's going to hurt a reporter when it's going to be on tape? You know, so I'm laughing now, but I take it very seriously. And when I'm in my reporter role, I take it very seriously. I do a lot of research. I do a lot of homework. I do a lot of soul searching. Actually, I use the Chip Landman rule. My brother's name is Chip Landman. And I say to myself, if someone were doing a story about my brother, would I think what I'm doing is fair? Do you know what I mean? I try to put myself in the shoes of a person who's being targeted in a story. And I see whether I would think if somebody did it to my brother, would it be fair? And if yes, then I just do it. And then that's my job as a reporter, to reveal when something bad has happened. But I try, I don't know if you've heard this, but it's called compassion fatigue. And it's very prevalent among reporters who have been around a long time. You just start thinking, oh, I don't care, just go away. So I work very hard not to have that. I work very hard to respect each person who comes to me, to respect each story that comes to me, to listen to each person who comes to me, and to make the best and most honorable decision that I can, knowing that I have this huge responsibility and you know, and a little bit of power to change the world a little bit if things go right. Does that answer your question? Yes.
So it seems like you live in two worlds. You live in the fiction world and you live in this reality world. And you know, in the fiction world, you can create characters. Is there sometimes a temptation as you're putting together a story to, you know, maybe present things a little differently to make your story better, or how do you balance that?
You're asking whether there's a temptation to tweak the story a little bit to make the story better.
Right.
No. I mean, no. I mean, one of the things that's wonderful about reality, you can just write all this stuff down. One of the things that's wonderful about reality is that it's always fascinating, it's always interesting, and the realness of it is what's compelling. And the realness of what people say is better than anything I could ever make up. So no, I have no problem keeping my absolute reality in journalism separate from my whatever I want to do imagination in writing fiction. I wondered actually initially whether my brain would do it, whether my brain could make stuff up. You know what I mean? Because for the last however many years, I've never made anything up. You know, I create how something looks. I write a story, and I'm in the edit booth with the video editor, making the story, making a little movie with graphics and effects and sound and music, and you know, it's a little movie. So I'm creative, but what's true is true, and what's real is real. And I wondered if my brain would let me make stuff up. I was happy to realize that it did. Yes?
You sound kind of like a prosecutor to me.
Ah.
Husband is a defense attorney.
Uh-huh.
How does that work?
She's saying I sound like a prosecutor, and my husband is a defense attorney. How does that work? I never thought of myself as a prosecutor. I see why. I look at myself as defending the little guy, rather than prosecuting, rather than going after the bad guy. I look at myself as the person who stands up for the little guy. I'm trying to make the system work. I'm trying to make it be fair. When I was growing up, my mother would say, I would say to my mom, but that isn't fair. And she'd say, the world isn't fair. And I would say, why not? Why not? And that's one of the reasons that I decided to be a reporter too, is that I wanted to make the world be a fairer place. So I look at myself as a defense person too. I do go after the bad guys, certainly I do, but I do that for making the world be a better place. Having my husband is a really wonderful civil rights and criminal defense attorney, and who, you know, he represented Muhammad Ali in the Supreme Court in his conscientious objector case, and has done a lot of wonderful work. So it's wonderful to have in-house counsel. That's what's good about having a lawyer husband. I can say, I need to keep this guy in jail for another day. How would I do that? How do I get a search warrant? I need to, you know, need to keep someone in custody, or what would a lawyer say, or what would a lawyer do, or what would the police say? So having in-house counsel is fabulous. He's also, my husband is also incredibly supportive, incredibly hilarious. He read my first book, page by page. I'll tell this fast. Read my first book, page by page. He read the first 5 pages. I heard him laughing. I was so happy. I mean, I hit around the corner to get the response. I'm so needy. So he reads the first 5 pages. He's laughing. The next day, he reads the next 5 pages, laughing. At about page 50, I'm hiding around the corner, waiting for my daily dose of approval, and I hear nothing. I hear nothing. So I came out and I said, oh, it's bad. It's bad, isn't it? I can't write. I should never have done this. This is a bad idea. It's terrible, isn't it? And he says, sweetheart, is something going to happen soon? So that was my first bit of knowledge into that in a book, something has to happen. So that's what I learned after all those years, that writing a page-turning novel is what I want to do. I'm so thrilled that the second part of my career is fiction. Thank you all very much for being here today.